Happy Tuesday, guys. Welcome back to another episode of Eat, Train, Prosper. Today's Brian and myself, and we have a special guest on by the name of Mike Millner. Today, we're going to talk with Mike about the power of your personality. But before we jump into the episode details, Mike, can you introduce yourself for everyone?
Yeah. I appreciate you guys having me on. My name is Mike Millner. I am the owner of Peak Optimization Performance, or POP for short. I actually named my company after my grandfather. I called Pop Up. So he passed away, unfortunately, right before I started my business. But I've been in the industry for a while, for about 10 years, I guess now. Started as a personal trainer in a very small, locally owned gym, just doing like one-on-one sessions, small groups, that sort of thing. And then found my passion in nutrition. And it really stemmed from my own struggle. I was an athlete growing up and never had to worry about, what I was eating and what I was doing. I just stayed naturally pretty lean and fit. And then college hit and I picked up on some typical college kid habits and drank a lot and ate a lot and gained a lot of weight. And then I was like, shit, well, I don't even recognize myself anymore. So I started doing everything wrong. And that was chronic dieting, a lot of cardio, yo-yo dieting, losing weight, gaining it back. And it was really frustrating. And when I finally found strength training, that was like the first kind of paradigm shattering moment. I was like, oh, I don't have to do 2 hours of cardio a day to make progress. So that's amazing because I hate cardio. And so that was the first part of it. But then the second part was seeing so many other people still struggling with nutrition. And that was like the sticking point for myself and for a lot of others at the gym that I was training at. And they would show up every day and their bodies weren't changing. They're like, what am I doing wrong? I'm showing up at the gym. I'm doing all the things, but nothing's happening. And so I'm like, there must be something to this nutrition thing. And my personality is I like to go all in on something and understand it to probably, way too extreme, but that's probably why I was a chronic dieter, but it helped me in learning for myself what I needed to do to get out of that hole and, overcame some issues with eating disorders and body dysmorphia and all of that and wanted to pay it forward. Started working for another company as a nutrition coach, didn't see eye to eye with their philosophy. And that gave me the opportunity to then start my business and do things the way that I felt was the appropriate way to do things. And that's kind of where we're at today.
Super cool. Mike, are you a solopreneur or do you have a team around you?
So I'm the sole owner of the business, but at this point we've grown. I started my business just under 4 years ago and we've grown pretty quickly. So I have a pretty solid team right now of about, I think we're at 11 coaches now that work for me and have some other positions in place that help, keep the train moving.
Cool. So thanks for that introduction, Mike. And before we jump into the meat and potatoes of the episode, just want to give a little recap on what's going on. Like, so how's your last 7 days been?
Yeah, so it's been a little bit interesting. I've been experimenting with some things as I like to do. I like to be the guinea pig before I tell anybody else to do something. The last 7 days, I have not had any caffeine, which I'm a big fan of coffee. Like part of my morning routine, sit down, I like to write. So every single morning I wake up, I get my coffee and I write for usually the first 45 minutes of my day. And that's how I start my morning. And having to cut out the caffeine from my life has been an interesting revelation on just how dependent I was on it. And it's definitely impacted my performance in the gym. I haven't been as motivated to show up. My workouts haven't been great, but I want to see it through. I'm going to go through the entire month with no coffee. So if I sound like I have no idea what I'm talking about in this episode, now you understand why. I just want to put
the coffee.
Put that out there. Yeah.
Question for you on that. So did you just go like cold turkey or are you like, did you go through like a weaning process? Are you doing any decaf?
Yep. So I'll do a cup of decaf just because it's like the habit of like sitting with my coffee and writing. I feel like it helps for some reason. It helps me be creative. So I'll do a cup of decaf and I just went cold turkey, just started and switched to decaf and that's it. And that's,
I did that back in, I want to say it was June. It was June or July. I did 30 days without any caffeine. And yeah, it's eye-opening because it's like, especially people like us, you don't like to think of like, I don't know. I don't like dependency, like, oh, I don't have dependencies. Those are for people with like, drug habits and stuff. And then you get off that coffee and you are dragging ass and the headache hits and stuff. And you're like, oh, holy shit. Like that's real. That thing that people talk about. Like, and you don't have to be like a 5 cup a day person like me. I'm like, 1 to 2, but like when you just stop having it, like you feel it. It's crazy. So yeah, I've been there. It's interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I was like more of a 2 to 3 cups per day, and I noticed the energy thing was first. It was just knowing, like, seeing my performance when I was at the gym, and that was the first sign. But then I started noticing a little bit of like the brain fog, where I was not quite as sharp as I wanted to be in certain situations, and it's kind of like dragged that like kind of low grade fatigue that hangs around, and you're like, when is this going to go away? So I'll keep you posted if that does go away.
Yeah, please do. Brian, what's been going on with you?
Yeah, Straker did a whole cold turkey coffee thing too. So it's funny you didn't bring that up, but I know you experienced a lot of the same symptoms, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So for me, the comedy of horrors around my life continues. So we got my nanny back from COVID, which is great. But within that time frame, the nanny that we had hired for the 5 weeks in San Diego backed out. So now we're going to San Diego for 5 weeks in February, and we don't have a nanny at the moment. So that whole process starts over again. Yes.
Okay. Can we just put this out there, right? Podcast listeners, if you are a nanny or know someone who is a nanny in the Boulder, Colorado or San Diego area.
San Diego. Our Boulder situation's cool. San Diego.
I feel like you should have a backup because
what we really need? You know what we really need in Boulder is an overnight babysitter. Apparently these things exist. I've heard about these from friends. They literally have babysitters that show up and take care of your kids overnight, so you can go like spend a night in a hotel or whatever. And we've never had that. So
I know someone. I will connect you with her.
Gangster. Okay. Yeah. Awesome.
And
look at that. Making things happen. So 5 weeks in San Diego, February 20th to March 23rd. We need a nanny, 8 to 2, 5 days a week. We'll pay well. So that's happening. We are leaving for Mexico tomorrow. We thought that maybe we would catch COVID because our nanny had COVID. So we were testing like all throughout the week. Turns out none of us caught COVID, which is awesome. So we're leaving tomorrow morning for Mexico. Going to spend 5 days there. Really amped. It's an all-inclusive resort where there's like activities and stuff for the kids. So we should actually get like a nice vacation out of it. And man, I feel like there was something else bad that happened, but I'm so excited about Mexico that I can't even remember what it is now. So we'll just move on and talk about your 7 days and then get into our interview here.
Yeah. So there was a conference here in Scottsdale. I mean, one of the things that's really cool is like within the last 30 days, there's been 2 like semi-big nutrition conferences. The first one is where Mike and I met in person, and there was another one just this weekend, and they're literally 5 minutes down the road. So I'm super like privileged, I should say, that they're just like here, and I'm like, yeah, cool. And I just go and meet people, friends from the internet that we follow each other on Instagram and we'll talk and stuff, but have never met up in person. So I did that. One of my old clients was there and I had no idea. So I got to meet him in person, and it's just really, really cool. And it's like, I don't know, I still feel like not dumbfounded, but like surprised by like these are legitimate work conferences for my career, and I really want to go, and it's a lot of fun, and I'm like emotionally and mentally invested in what I'm learning, and it's like it just feels unreal, to be completely honest. So that was super, super cool. And then last night, a bit of a funny story. We're in what, second week of the year now, but the gym is packed, right? And I didn't get to go to the gym until yesterday evening because I was just like super head down on work, getting a bunch of stuff done. And it's like right next to the college because Arizona State is here. And like, college students are going to go to gym at like 8 to 10 p.m. It's like, whatever, people are up super late. So it was packed, and I had to do the pendulum squat last. And I was just like, it is what it is. Like, I'm just going to do it. It was the very last exercise of my leg training, and it bodied me. I got so nauseous and stuff. I couldn't driving home, and I was like, it was like 10 p.m. and I was like, I feel absolutely terrible. I'm never doing this again. And it was just one of those things like, why did I think I would be okay? Just like going through my full leg training session and then, going to like literally 0 RIR on the pendulum squat at 10 p.m. on a Monday night. And I felt absolutely terrible. So I came home, like ate a little bit, and immediately went to bed.
Was it reminiscent of the Tourmaline Hill sprints that you talked about last week?
Not that bad. that was like why do I even show up in my life anymore? Like those thoughts, like just so defeated, but I got in the car and, immediately drove home after those hill sprints. I'm not joking. I would sit in my truck for 20 minutes, just questioning life. Yeah. Questioning life. Yeah. And I only lived like literally it's a 30-second drive home, and I would just sit there. So yeah, not quite that. I'm happy those days are behind me, but we'll see what the future holds. Okay, so enough from me. Mike, so I mean, for me, right, for Brian, I know a lot of the listeners out there, like, we just want to talk about, like, neurotyping. So can you just give us like a basic intro, explanation to it, and then let's start peeling back the layers of this onion.
Yeah, I love it. I've been practicing for a very long time of how to keep the explanation short and to the point, and it's really complicated. But no, it's essentially understanding your personality and the role that plays in your nutrition, training, and lifestyle. So we can take tests, we can look at brain chemistry, we can look at neurotransmitter balance through blood work, but it doesn't really give us an assessment of the whole system. And that's really what we're assessing with personality traits. So with personality psychology, we've looked at how do we draw conclusions about the neurological makeup of an individual based off of the personality characteristics that they have. So an example would be somebody who is more, a risk taker, somebody who's more extroverted, outgoing. Typically, that's going to be very strongly connected with the dopaminergic system or dopamine receptors in your body. So we can safely assume that somebody with those characteristics is either a high dopamine individual, meaning they have high levels of dopamine, or they're very sensitive to dopamine. Their receptors are very sensitive. So once we know that the kind of neurological makeup of each person based off of their neurotype or their personality type, then we can start to draw conclusions about what's going to be the most effective training protocol for them, what's going to be the most effective nutrition plan, and then what are some other variables that we want to look at from a lifestyle perspective. Now, when I say what's going to be the best, I'm not talking about like, how do we program optimally for there's 5 neurotypes. So it's not like there's one program that fits, for every single person who is this one neurotype. What I mean is, what are they going to enjoy the most? And how can we create a plan that's kind of working with their nature versus fighting against it? So somebody who's more detail oriented, very structured and organized, we're not just going to throw a bunch of like random, variety in the mix just because we like to keep something that's consistent and linear for that individual because it works with the way that their brain works. If they think linearly, if they think in a very organized manner, we want to keep their training and nutrition in the same fashion so that it makes sense for them. And they're like, yeah, I can stick with this, right? Because at the end of the day, as coaches, our jobs are basically adherence and sustainability, right? Stick with the plan long enough, it's going to be effective. If you enjoy it, then we know we've got results for life, because if you enjoy what you're doing, you're going to stick with it longer. So at the end of the day, we're using neurotyping as a tool to create better adherence and compliance, and to allow our clients to enjoy the process more while working with their nature versus fighting against it. So I know you said short, but as I mentioned, it's always a convoluted explanation. Hopefully that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. Brian, do you have any follow-ups on that one?
Yeah, I mean, if we want to shift a little, do you have anything specifically on that?
I just wanted to kind of transition to the conversation into like, Mike, how did you begin to facilitate these ideas around it? How did this even come on like your radar type of thing? Because to be completely honest, you're the only person I've ever heard, talking about this type of thing. So it's just, fascinating on multiple levels.
Christian Thibodeau on T Nation. That was the first time I heard about it.
Okay, I just lied to everyone. I did hear about that briefly, but yeah. Okay, that's like the only two. Yeah.
Yeah. So Christian was my first mentor and one of my early coaches, and that is exactly where. So it's interesting because Charles Poliquin, who actually started talking a lot about, in particular, dopamine and how it relates to athletes when he was training high-level athletes. And most of his high-level athletes were dopamine dominant. And then Christian, kind of was a student of Charles, and he took that concept another step further and was like, well, dopamine is just one neurotransmitter in the body. Like, let's look at all the other systems and how they integrate here. And I remember the first time that I reached out to him, one of the nicest people you'll ever meet, he offered to get on a consultation call totally for free. And we spent 2 hours on Skype, and he was just explaining everything to me about what I had been struggling with. At that point, I was struggling with my nutrition, but I was also program hopping with training. And I was like, I tried CrossFit for a little while. I tried bodybuilding for a little while. I tried powerlifting for a little. I just kept jumping from different modalities. And I was like, what's wrong with me? Like, I can't stick with anything, even though I understand the science behind it. I know what makes an effective program. for some reason, I just can't stick with it. And he started explaining to me my personality type. He's, you're a type 2A, you're adrenaline dominant, you're like myself. We need variety. If something becomes repetitive, we lose interest, we get bored, we lose motivation, and we look for the next thing. And it was like the whole 2-hour conversation was just a series of aha moments and light bulb moments where I'm like, man, this makes too much sense for me to ignore. So I started working with him as he was implementing the system very early on in the process. And Tibbs is very big on, like, when it comes to building muscle and building strength, and he's as good as it gets, and his that's where his passion is. But I felt like there was this whole other area on the nutrition side where that was my passion. I was like, if this makes sense with training, and I can see once I started doing his programming, my body changed very quickly, and I actually enjoyed my workouts. And I was like, man, he's onto something here. So I started doing my own research. I started like really diving in on the psychology side of things, which is a big passion of mine, and connecting the dots between that and nutrition and lifestyle. I wanted to be able to bridge the gap to the general population individual who really, maybe they don't care so much about, the science of muscular hypertrophy and all of these things that we love to nerd out on. But like, how can I take these concepts and make it applicable to the everyday person who just wants to be healthy and fit and stick with a program for a while? And so that was, where, and Christian has been instrumental in that process, and just giving me the tools and resources, and then doing my own research in personality psychology, and just really evolving it to what it is now with what we utilize at my company.
Is the, we should probably talk about the 5 different types, right? So is it 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, and 3?
Yep, that's exactly it.
Can you talk about what each one, kind of the distinguishing characteristics of each?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we look at the 5 different neurotypes, that doesn't mean that there's only 5 personalities in existence. It's just an easy way to group them, to help understand the concepts here. So every single person is going to be a mix of multiple personality types, because we have our genetic makeup, but then we also have our life experience, how we were raised, the environment we were raised in, our, everything that we go through shapes our personality. And when you look at the research in personality psychology, basically what it says is that we start with this personality, where it's like kind of our genetic predisposition, and then we just accumulate more. So it kind of broadens as we evolve, as we grow, as we get older. So an example would be like somebody who is naturally introverted, like myself. That doesn't mean that extrovertedness is unattainable. It just means that if my personality is starting like over here on the right side and extrovertedness is over here on the left side, it means just I have a longer distance to go to become more extroverted. Whereas somebody who's more naturally extroverted on the left side, right, they don't have a far distance to go to obtain that personality trait. So everything is modifiable based off of your life experience and what you want to accomplish. Having said that, we do have a genetic predisposition, which when we group the 5 neurotypes, we look at it from what is the main neurotransmitter system that drives their behavior. So type 1A, they are driven mostly by dopamine, the pleasure response. All habit formations are created through the dopamine receptors in response to our own dopamine. It's very powerful. There's a reason why most decisions are made off of like FOMO, and they're emotional, because the emotional trigger of like getting a dopamine response, like when you're gambling or whatever people are doing to elicit that response, jumping out of a plane, like there is an intense feeling that is triggered from dopamine, which creates and facilitates behavior change. Like every habit or every behavior change, there's a trigger, there's an action, and there's a reward. Most of the time, the reward is just from our own dopamine. So with type 1As, they're very outgoing. They're very extroverted because they are sensitive to dopamine. So they're like the leaders of the group. They're very vocal. They're very argumentative. They take up a lot of space, both physically and verbally. So you kind of know when the 1A enters the room, there's somebody that's like a natural leader. They demand attention. They are who they are, and they don't give a fuck what anybody thinks. Like they're not going to change for somebody else. This is who they are. So when it comes to like their training preferences, This is somebody who loves to win every workout. The competitive drive is intense. You think of like just a natural born killer, like a Michael Jordan, like they're going to win no matter what. And that's how they approach every workout. Then when you shift down to a 1B, dopamine is still the system that drives their behavior. The biggest difference is that 1Bs have very high levels of acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is an interesting neurotransmitter that plays a role in memory, cognitive function. It also plays a role in muscle reaction speed. And so we have acetylcholine in our muscle spindles. And so we have individuals who are high acetylcholine, like they have high levels of acetylcholine. They're very naturally gifted, very explosive. And that's kind of like their personality, explosive personality. They're also leaders, but they're more of like the lead by example versus a 1A who's more of like the vocal, like, you know, I'm the leader because I'm going to talk louder than everyone, versus a 1B who's like, I'm going to show you that I'm the leader. They're great at multitasking because acetylcholine, it allows your brain to shift from active. There's actually multitasking is kind of a myth. We don't have the ability to focus on two things, but our brain can focus so quickly back and forth that it gives the appearance of multitasking, which acetylcholine facilitates. So they have great short-term memory, great at multitasking. They're very imaginative, very explosive, naturally athletic. So they're the individual where you show them a complex movement and you just show them once and they nail it just like that. So very naturally gifted. They're also the individuals that perform well with lifts that utilize the stretch reflex. So if you see somebody like bouncing a bar off their chest, typically it's because they have high levels of acetylcholine. They actually feel better getting that momentum and allowing that stretch reflex to hit. Other things with their personality, that their explosiveness can be with just in everyday life. So if you've ever met somebody who you can get into like a blowout argument, like they go 0 to 100 very quickly, but then they go back to 0 again. And to them, it's like it never happened. And you are like dwelling on it. And you're like, oh, that argument was awful. I can't believe that. And they're like, what are you talking about? Like, it's done. It's over with. So they can go from 0 to 100 and back to 0 very quickly. Similar to
I have a quick question about that.
Yeah.
So there's a website, nootropicsdepot.com. Like, I'm just put out there, I'm not affiliated like whatsoever. They just put out some quality products and stuff. And I know like acetylcholine is one thing that like people are beginning to supplement like more of. And I'm just curious if you have any experience with that, or if someone maybe, which this is kind of a little bit of a downstream question I do have, is like, can you do things to help you shift between some of the subclassifications?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I do have a lot of experience with that. So with acetylcholine, it's always an it depends answer, because if a type 1B who already has high levels of acetylcholine takes more, it could actually be a negative. They can actually feel worse. A type 1A who has low levels of acetylcholine and they take some, they'll actually feel a lot better. Acetylcholine, in some way, shape, or form, protects all of the other neurotransmitters, because we have neurotransmitters that amplify and amp up brain activity. Dopamine, glutamate, adrenaline, those are all amplifiers. They activate your brain speed to get you ready for whatever it is that you're trying to do. Then we have neurotransmitters that calm the brain down. They want to shut off the nervous system, serotonin and GABA being the main two. Acetylcholine actually plays a role in both amplification and inhibition. So it protects all of the other neurotransmitters. When acetylcholine is high, we don't rely on as much adrenaline to get us ready for a stressor, whatever stressful event we're about to face. And if we don't, so now you'll see how all the dots are connected. Adrenaline is fabricated downstream from dopamine. So you've got dopamine, noradrenaline, adrenaline. The more dopamine that you use, that you convert into adrenaline, the more you're depleting dopamine. So if I'm riding high on adrenaline for way too long, I'm depleting dopamine in that process, right? So if I have acetylcholine that's higher and I'm not relying as much on adrenaline, well, now I'm preserving dopamine. By preserving dopamine, I'm preserving noradrenaline, adrenaline. By preserving those neurotransmitters, I'm actually relying less on the inhibitors because I'm not getting as amped up. My adrenaline output is not as high, so I don't need as much GABA and serotonin to calm the brain down. So it kind of connects, and that's why so many people are fascinated by acetylcholine supplementation at this point, because it does help protect all the other neurotransmitters. However, you have to understand where you're at. It just adding more, like more of a good thing can become a bad thing. So it's always a matter of like, start small, see how you feel, and then go from there. That's typically my recommendation. If I know that an individual is already somebody who has high levels of acetylcholine, then I'll tell them just to skip it. Like they're type 1B personalities, you can usually tell pretty quickly. And they'll feel like crap if they supplement with it.
Got it. Okay. Sorry to kind of derail you there. It's just like, I know I'll forget if I don't ask right
now.
No,
it makes sense because then it helps the understanding of everything that we're talking about. Type 2A, my neurotype. We are adrenaline dominant. So that's the main system that drives our behavior. What that looks like is we're very sensitive to any increase in adrenaline. So when we're at rest, adrenaline's very low. When you're sensitive to a neurotransmitter or a hormone, typically you have lower levels at rest because you don't need to produce as much to get the job done, right? If I was resistant, it's like the message is not getting home to the cells, so you keep producing more, like insulin resistance. Your body keeps putting out more insulin because the receptors are not getting that message, right? It's like a lock and key trying to unlock the door, but it's not opening. So it's like, let's try harder, let's produce more, let's knock louder. I always use the example of like, it's the equivalent of resistance or sensitivity to like alcohol. So if you think of alcohol sensitivity, which would be like, man, I only need one drink to get the job done, right? But if I am resistant, I need to keep drinking a lot to get the same result. So with adrenaline, because we're sensitive to it, we have low levels at rest, which means we're typically pretty introverted, quiet, docile, but you put us in a situation where adrenaline is amplified and all of a sudden we become like this alpha version of ourselves. Like you're in a stressful situation, a 2A is going to come alive. They're going to be way more outgoing, way more talkative, way more extroverted. It's almost like the Incredible Hulk, Bruce Banner, kind of example. You've got the quiet, nerdy scientist, and then you've got the Incredible Hulk that comes out with that adrenaline. So that's very similar to a type 2A. We are also people pleasers. We are very, we like to try new things. So variety is a huge thing because if we're sensitive to adrenaline, anytime you try something new, you're going to get that adrenaline response from it. When it becomes repetitive, you no longer get the same adrenaline response. So you get bored very easily. Type 2As get bored very easily. And so those are some of the characteristics there. Typically with training, we like to program hop. We like to try different things. A lot of 2As gravitate towards CrossFit because there's kind of that natural variety built into it, right? No two workouts are the same. That usually works well for a type 2A. Then we got type 2Bs. The main neurotransmitter system for them is glutamate. Glutamate is a neurotransmitter that's kind of like our emotional amplifier. It also plays a role in memory. But when you have high levels of glutamate, your emotions are very intense. They're amplified. So when you feel like happy, you feel euphoric with high levels of glutamate. Or if you're sad, you feel like depressed with high levels of glutamate. So 2Bs are very emotional beings. They make decisions with emotion. They like to feel. So they're the people that love the mind muscle connection, the pump. They love to feel things. They are also people pleasers. They will do anything for like people that they admire or respect. So they're like, the hockey player that's going to dive in front of the net for a goalie to block a puck, right? They'll give themselves to another person. They fall in love very easily. They're the ones that typically get their heart broken, like pour all of themselves into other people. And that's typically what we see with type 2Bs. They also like, when they get almost addicted to the positive feelings of certain situations. So, if they get dressed up and they feel really good about themselves, like they love to dress really nice and get that feeling of, because it's all the emotional amplification for them. And then lastly, we have a type 3. Type 3, the main system is serotonin. Serotonin being responsible for calming the brain down. With them, they actually have low levels of serotonin, which drives their anxiety up. So they're typically the people that are higher anxiety, higher stress individuals. They're very detail oriented, very structured. They like repetition. They like predictability. They like to know what's coming. They don't like to take risks. If you think about the reasoning behind that, if you have lower serotonin, so it's harder to calm your brain down, uncertainty and unpredictability is going to drive that further. So that's why they love routine. They love structure. If I know what's coming, I don't have to worry as much. It's predictable. It's planned. So they love to know like their plans as far out in advance. I don't know if you guys have ever had clients who are like, can you tell me what the next like 36 weeks are going to look like? And we're like, let's just get through week 1. But they want to know everything in advance. So that's typically what we see with a type 3. So with them, it's really about feeling safe. It's about feeling in control. It's mastering the movement through repetition. They can become efficient at anything, but they just need the time to put in the reps to get comfortable with mastering that movement so they feel in control.
I'm sure you get this response a lot, but as you were going through listing off kind of the personality traits of each of those, I literally felt like there was a piece of me identified in each one, and that there were pieces of each one that I was like, that's not me at all.
Yep. Yeah, very common. So like I said, everybody's going to have that like one dominant type. And then you're going to have your secondary type, and then you're going to have the third. So we want to know all parts of the equation, all parts like, what's your dominant profile, what's your secondary profile. Mm-hmm. Nobody's ever going to be like 100% of those characteristics fit me to a T.
Right.
So we just have to look at what's the one that for the most part, you feel like most resonates with you.
I did the test you sent me a number of years ago in like 2017, 18, something like that. Are you still using the same test or a version of that test?
Yeah, it's still the same test, I believe.
Okay, cool. So are there 224 total points available? Is that right?
That's a great question. I honestly don't know what the total.
Actually, so I just went through. I just looked up my old chart and found my scores from when we did this and added them up, and there were 224 total points. My most dominant category had 88 points, so it was like very, very spread, relatively evenly throughout. Yeah. I had an 88 for 1B, and then I had a 48 for 3. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then all the other ones were in the 20s. So it's just like this weird mix of like, I do have that rigidity and that structure, and I love knowing what's happening 36 weeks from now, type thing. But then I also, I didn't align as much, to be honest, with what you were saying about the 1Bs, but according to the test, that's where the majority of my chunk was.
Yeah. And it's interesting because oftentimes we'll see type 2As are the ones where we kind of find a piece of ourselves because we crave variety, and we also have the ability to kind of take on the behaviors of people. Like we can modify our behavior very well to fit in. We're like social chameleons. We can kind of fit in to any situation. So in certain times we might be more extroverted, certain times we might be more introverted, certain times we can fit this characteristic. So typically when somebody's like, you know what, all of them kind of resonate a little bit with me, that's usually a sign of a 2A.
Well, that was my lowest score.
So, so looking at like the 1Bs and 2As have similarities, so sometimes differentiating there, but it's always like, and it'd be interesting to see if you took the assessment again, I'm
going to do it. No, that was like my first thought is after this show's over, I'm going to take it. I might send it over to Aaron if that's cool too, and have him do it.
Yeah, definitely.
But no, that's all super interesting. Aaron, any follow-ups on that stuff?
Yeah, as Mike was going through, I was like taking like some quick notes because like Mike said, I'm listening to him like, oh yeah, I'm that one, and then he would keep going, and I'm like, I don't know now. So yeah, Mike, is there or Brian, is there a test that you would, because I'm sure when the listeners listen to this, they're like, I want to do that and see what might be most applicable to me. So is there like a website, or do you have one on your site, Mike, or anything like that you'd recommend?
Yeah, the one on my site is free. They can just go to neurotypetraining.com, and it's right there on the main site. You can take the assessment. It's 100 questions. As you mentioned, the points, it can actually vary because if you answer something, it could end up being negative points depending on the score. So the point total can vary depending on what your answers are.
Gotcha. So can you briefly expand on, you mentioned that some types, like specifically the 2s, prefer variation, and that the 3s don't prefer variation. So can you expand on that a little? And then where do the 1s, 1A, 1B fall as far as like preferring variation in their training? Yeah.
So typically 1Bs and 2As are the ones that crave the most variety. And the reason for that is with the 2As, it's because of adrenaline. With the 1Bs, it's because of acetylcholine, because they like to be challenged, and they like to have multiple things that they're focusing on. So they'll also get bored very quickly. Same thing with 2As. We get bored very quickly. So they do the best with variety. Typically the 2Bs and 3s, anybody that is a higher anxiety individual, usually the more anxiety you have, the less variety you crave. So 2Bs and 3s typically are the highest in anxiety. They're the most anxious. 3s usually being a little bit more so, because variety can throw you off if you don't know what's coming, or if you're doing a new movement that you've never done before, things like that. So with 2Bs and 3s, they do like more predictability. Typically 2Bs like to follow more of like a traditional bodybuilding style of programming. And 3s, they just like something that's like very linear and structured, and they know what's coming. 1As don't need that much variety as long as they can push and feel like they're winning. Like they only care about adding more weight to the bar. They care about winning the workout. They care about, there's like that competitive drive. They don't need a lot of variety as long as they can put forth like max effort and like go all out and have that feeling after a workout. They don't need as much variety. So 1Bs and 2As are the neurotypes that crave the most variety. 2Bs and 3s crave the least variety.
What would you say when you're looking at the different sports that people can do within strength sports, and you have like CrossFit and powerlifting and bodybuilding and strongman, and like each one of these sports has like different characteristics of whether they have variety or don't have variety, right? So what about in a situation where an athlete comes to you and the sport that they're pursuing doesn't actually match up with their neurotype, like a 2B or a 3 wants to do CrossFit, or somebody who is like a 1A or 1B. I mean, myself, like 1B is my dominant one, which means I should crave variety. And yet I'm pursuing physique, which is the most regimented and bordering on monotonous application of strength sport.
Yeah. So it's a great question. So first I'll go over like the tendencies, and then we'll talk about how you go against the grain a little bit. So 1As typically gravitate towards powerlifting or strongman because it facilitates that lift heavier, add weight. 1Bs will typically be like Olympic lifters or CrossFit. 2As, CrossFit is usually the main sport that they gravitate towards. 2Bs would be anything aesthetically driven, bodybuilding, bikini, that sort of thing. And then type 3s can typically gravitate more towards endurance. They like the repetitive nature of just long distance running or cycling. If it comes to like strength based sports, then they can do anything. We have some type 3 clients that do really well at CrossFit, but again, it comes from feeling in total control of the movement. So they've had to master the movement pattern. They like to, they're technique geeks. They want to know exactly how to perform each lift. They want to work their way up. They want to, just feel in total control of every movement. So they can be power lifters. They can be, Olympic lifters. They can be CrossFit athletes, but they need to feel in total control of each movement before they progress. Now, when you go against the grain, what's interesting is there's different parts of what makes, like using your example, a 1B. 1Bs are typically competitive as well. So there's also the competitive drive of 1Bs. Oftentimes we'll do a little bit more extreme things because they have that competitive nature. They'll, like a lot of our clients that come to us from like extreme dieting, a lot of times they're 1Bs. They're like, I'm just going to rip the Band-Aid off. I'm just going to I'm going to hit this 75 hard for the next 75 days. I'm just going to do it because I know I can. So they'll challenge themselves with things like that, which is typically what we see even in something like bodybuilding, even though it's redundant, it's repetitive. Because it's kind of triggering that competitive side of you've got a goal, you've got an outcome. They're very goal oriented. Type 1Bs are very goal driven. So if you're like, here's the goal that you're working towards, they'll typically do whatever it takes to get there. Now, interestingly enough, 2Bs would be the worst candidates to be power lifters. They love mind muscle connection. They love the pump. They love how they feel after getting that pump. Paul Carter is a 2B. But he competed in powerlifting.
And he hated it. Yeah, he always talks about how that was like the worst time for him.
So going against his nature. And he talked about when he was training for powerlifting, he very rarely did fewer than 6 reps. He very rarely pushed his max for a low rep count because he kind of had that natural inclination that it was against his nature. This was before he had any understanding of neurotyping, and him and Christian are close friends. So he knows, He's very familiar with the system and how it works. But he talked about that. I saw him present And he said it was just a natural inclination to not just do like the 1 rep maxes and to stick with 6 reps or more, even as he was training and getting ready for a competition. Mm-hmm. So he kind of trained and more towards his neurotype, even in application for something that would be against his neurotype.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the application of the 1B dominance for me as you were going through that is A, the goal-oriented behavior of like, this is what I have to do to show up and like achieve the thing that's like in my mind to achieve. And then second, I kind of wonder whether the 1B also has influenced my like personal desire to train lifts mostly to like 0 to 1 reps from failure and like institute things like partial reps and beyond failure techniques and stuff like that, where I wasn't like super happy doing like a higher volume approach, stopping, 3 reps shy of failure, but doing more of everything. Like that wasn't vibing with me as much as coming in and like exerting effort and pushing to my limits, so to speak.
Yeah, that would be very conducive to like a type 1B for sure. It's stimulating more of like challenging different parts of your brain, which 1Bs need that. Like they need something, which is why 1Bs often will do more like supersets and things like that, where there's multiple things that you can focus on, or intensification methods. 2As and 1Bs love the intensity methods versus just, like you said, doing more.
So a couple questions for you. One, Mike, is there any kind of way that that some of these things we talked about, especially with like neurotransmitter dominance, there can be monitored or measured from a physiological standpoint?
Yes, you can do blood work and see where your levels are. But the issue that I have with that is it only gives you a snapshot in time, and it doesn't tell you the efficacy of the system as a whole. So you could say at that point in the snapshot that it was taken, I had high levels of dopamine, I had high levels of acetylcholine. But what if your dopamine receptors are shot, or your acetylcholine response is not what it should be? The system as a whole. So right now, as it stands, the most effective way is to monitor behavior. And the blood work tells us some information, but it really doesn't tell the whole story. So we need to see how things are actually playing out when it comes to behavior. Now, the biggest disruptor of homeostasis, pretty much with all things, is stress. So when you're under periods of chronic stress, that's when you'll see people starting to take on behaviors of a neurotype that's not their dominant type. You'll typically see, like, I know when I'm under a lot of stress, type 2As are the most sensitive to stress because we're adrenaline dominant. I'll start to act like a 2B. I'll get way more emotional. I'll get way all like in my feels. I'll get in my head about things. I'll dwell on things longer than I normally do. So I start to act like a 2B when I'm under periods of more stress. And then when I'm feeling good about it, it's like periods of euphoria. I start to act more like a 1B. I'm more of like a natural leader. I'm a little bit more extroverted. I start to set more ambitious goals for myself. So it always depends. That's where I think like the blood work can kind of be tricky because it doesn't really tell us the whole story.
Perfect. Thank you for saying that. And that it makes perfect sense. The next question I have for you, and this one is something that, so let me ask it and then I'll kind of preface it a little bit. So do you think kind of as someone, especially as we, get into our mid, late 20s, 30s and stuff like that, and really like self-development becomes like a very more just prominent aspect of our lives and like, evolving to become that, that next level of ourselves? Do you think that some of, we can shift between the different systems, or neurotypes? For example, with you scaling your business now and having like, 10 plus assistant coaches and stuff under you, I'm sure there are characteristics that maybe, Mike of like 4 years ago naturally didn't have that you needed to like acquire and change in order to become like, 2022 Mike, who now does these things.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and the answer is a little bit of yes and no. And I'll say changing like your dominant type is not really kind of what we're doing when we acquire those skills to become like the whole, self-actualization and becoming better versions of ourselves. Like I took a course with Jordan Peterson, and he explains it as, the personality toolbox. And he's like, you have this toolbox that you were born with. And then your goal is to add as many tools to that toolbox from a personality. Like you should be adding tools to your personality toolbox all throughout your life. And that's the constant pursuit of getting better. It's not that original toolbox change or like is now different. It's just like you still have that one that you were born with. you've just added a lot of tools to that toolbox, or you've sharpened some of the tools in that original toolbox. And that's kind of his explanation, which I think fits well because it answers your question. Yes, you're different because you've acquired all of those new skills, but you're still the same because it was that same original toolbox, if that kind of makes sense.
No, it does, and I ask mostly from like a personal exploration type thing. Like I'm interested. I'm gonna right after we get off this, I'm gonna go through it and find out. But I mean, naturally, incredibly introverted myself, and it's through Strike Your Nutrition Co. and a lot of like the podcasts and stuff like that it's forced me into explore these different things. For instance, like my girlfriend's gonna leave for like 7 or 8 days, this week, and like I'm pumped to just like literally be by myself for 8 days, and like I'll talk to Brian once, I'll talk to clients, and I probably won't I'll say a word to another human in real life, and like I'm okay with that type of deal. Where other people would like be dying from that, but I just thrive by myself. So it's interesting, how you can, as you go through paces of life and want to evolve to become different versions of yourself, that you will take on these like new skills, and add on, like you said, add new tools to the toolbox, but that default set of tools is still like what you may naturally gravitate back to from like a pure default standpoint.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think that what I found the gift of neurotyping to be, which is what I hope it is for other people who utilize this methodology or apply it in any way that they see fit, is self-awareness. Above all else, that's it. Because I think that self-awareness is the greatest catalyst for change, right? You don't know what you don't know. So once you become aware of either tendencies that you have, behavioral tendencies, shortcomings, things that you want to change about yourself, like once it's known, now you get to take action. You don't, if you don't know that it exists, it's hard to change something that you don't know exists. So that's really like the gift that I found. Having said that, that doesn't mean that we should be placing ourselves in these boxes and say, well, I'm this neurotype, so I'm boxed in here. It means that we're aware of our tendencies, but now we should pursue life to acquire those skills, to challenge ourselves, to even try things that may not be a natural fit. And don't say, well, I shouldn't do this because it's against my neurotype, but maybe say, I know that I don't have the tendency for this. It just means that I have to work a little bit harder to acquire that skill. And that's how I look at it. As you're looking at a race, right? Some people who have that natural gift, they're starting a little bit ahead of you. But if you're starting from behind, it's not a disadvantage. You'll learn a lot through the process of acquiring that skill, even if it takes a little bit longer. And I think there's still a lot of value in that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Brian.
No, you're good. I was going to ask an additional question, kind of unrelated.
Okay, I'll wrap up on this and then you can ask it. So I really like the word you said there, tendencies, right? Because it's less of like it's more of like it's a natural draw, but it's not like something that you cannot break out of. And the example that really came to my mind is my girlfriend and I were very, very different personality types. I'm going to have her go through it, but she's like, I mean, it's funny because she's literally like as small as all hell, but she has this massive booming personality. She talks to everyone, and she's like, she's definitely like a 1A or a 1B. It was, but me, very, very opposite. And when we started our businesses in very similar times, we went on immediately different trajectories. And now we're kind of like, because our tendencies were different, kind of pulling back towards, each other as we've acquired different skills along the path at different routes. So it was just really, really interesting what you said there, but I really like the word tendencies.
Yeah, so we sort of touched on this in my last question where I asked about the person that maybe is not training for their neurotype necessarily. So I just want to put out like a hypothetical example and hear your thoughts on it. Because this story seems to be very common for me in what I'm doing now, post CrossFit days, where we have these people that I'm sure come from all different neurotypes, but they are finding that CrossFit is a problem for them, either A, because it's beating up their hormones and putting them into a position where their body's just not functioning optimally, or B, it's not creating the physique or aesthetic response that they're looking for. And it's, the lower intensity and the prioritization of recovery and stuff like that that's more important for them. So how do you deal with these situations like that, where someone's neurotype might be like, I need to be doing CrossFit because I need variety, and yet their body is telling them something different?
Yeah, so I love that question, because then it starts to open up to all the other variables that play a huge role, which would be like the amount of stress in your life, and what does your nutrition look like, and what are your daily habits look like, and how are you sleeping, and all of these other things. And even if we just zoom in and only focus on like the modality of CrossFit, I mean, let's be honest, it's not the most effective if we're just talking about somebody who wants to get leaner. Like if you want, the way that I look at it is you should be doing CrossFit if you want to be better at CrossFit.
Yeah, it's a performance sport.
It's a performance sport, right? Yeah. So a lot of times people use that as, oh, I'm going to, get lean and shredded with CrossFit. And then they find out like, okay, so now I'm beat up, like my joints are wrecked and I'm not recovering well. And there's a reason for that. It's very neurologically demanding. The recovery demands of a workout are typically more nervous system related than they are muscular related. Like our muscles actually recover very quickly. Our nervous system takes a long time to recover, which is why when you see people who make progress very early on, they just started CrossFit and they're like, oh my God, look at my body changing. That's your nervous system adapting. It's not necessarily that it's a super effective way of changing your body. It's simply the neurological, adaptation that's occurring, the brain communication to your muscles to perform these movements. Like that's like the newbie gains period.
Yep.
But then after that, and you're putting this constant demand and you're constantly adding volume, the nervous system has a hard time keeping up and you put yourself in a recovery debt almost every day. It adds up over time. So if we're talking about like just CrossFit as a means to change your body, I would look at it more as a means to perform better at CrossFit. If that's your goal, then for sure you should be doing CrossFit. Otherwise, I think there's more effective ways to get to that end goal.
Yeah. So then is that person then that should, maybe they're like a 1A or a 1B or 2A. So they really crave variety, but the modality of CrossFit is not great for them. So then do they end up on like, is the next step to end up on some sort of like hypertrophy physique style program, but maybe it's not one with like repeating movements A through E or something along those lines? Like, you mix up the variety, but you're still keeping in mind total volume per muscle group type thing, or, if you want to get a little more specific with that.
Yeah, for sure. So like there's ways to modify the training. Like the way that I train, I don't do any CrossFit style of training. When I'm doing something that's more like bodybuilding focused, it will have a little bit more of, supersets involved. It'll have more intensification methods, maybe more holds, more pauses, more isolated contractions, things that just keep the variety in there. So for me, it's like if I do, let's say I'm doing squats, and then the next week, the progression is just squats with slow eccentric. That's enough, even though I'm still doing squats and I'm doing squats again, you might think that that's repetitive. It's enough variety where it feels like a new movement. Like a 4-second eccentric squat is going to feel very different than just a straight back squat. Then we can maybe add a pause. Then we can do, different things. Maybe we change it to a front squat in the third week. There's different things that you can keep a hypertrophy training program intact for like a type 2A or a type 1B, but you can still give them the variety that they desire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things I do on all my general programs is we have like part A and B that repeat week to week so that we can get diagnostics and track metrics and stuff like that. And then part C, D, and E or whatever, if it exists, are kind of like forever changing. They're usually smaller muscle groups. They provide a little variety, mix it up, give you something fun, but you still get that like chunk of important work where you get those diagnostics in the beginning. So I've found that to be pretty effective as like a meshing of the two. But it is interesting as we dive into this neurotype stuff. There's some people that are like, I cannot stand the repeating movements. Like by week 4, I'm just like over them, and then there's other people that are like, could we just do the same, like all sections all the time? Like, could I just do Straker, exactly. Like no variety, just like, I want to know details and diagnostics for everything. So it is funny how those personality types play in.
Yeah, typically that's the type 3, who wants to know all the analytics because they want all the information. They want to know what's coming in advance.
I think personally for me, it's more of just like a desire of like my desire for progression is much higher than my like disdain for repetition.
Yeah, no, totally. I agree with that.
Like if you told me, Aaron, like if you do sets of 12 on the hack squat and go to failure in it, and it's this big emotional investment and you feel like crap, but your legs will grow week over week. Like I will 100% do that and just suck it up. But it's like, I don't know. It's all desire based to me. Mike, one of the last things I want to ask you, I know we talked about training a lot, which has been cool, but we haven't really talked about nutrition much. So can we kind of just have one last little thing where we shift into how some of the different neurotypes or some of your tendencies for each of them may influence how easy or likely different nutrition patterns and stuff might be for you?
Yeah, so really the lens that I look at this through is what's going to make the individual feel their best. Like we want to put them in the best neurological state as frequently as possible. What I mean by that is somebody who is higher stress, experiencing higher stress, well, we want to increase their inhibitors to calm their brain down. It's going to help them feel better. So for somebody who's like a type 3, where they do have a little bit higher anxiety, higher stressed individual, we're typically going to put them on a higher carb plan. Carbs increase serotonin. Serotonin calms the brain down. They're usually lower in serotonin. It actually works really well. For somebody who's like a type 1A, they're kind of the opposite. They have high levels of inhibitors. They have low levels of dopamine. They're sensitive to dopamine. So they're typically the people that we want to amplify brain activity at certain times and shut it down at certain times. Usually for type 1A, that means mostly protein and fats in the morning. That's going to help because if you're eating protein and fats, you're going to favor the transport of L-tyrosine over L-tryptophan. So they fight for transport. So if you're having protein and fats, you're favoring L-tyrosine. If you're having protein and carbs, you're favoring L-tryptophan. L-tryptophan will then increase serotonin. L-tyrosine will increase dopamine. So for a type 1A, in the morning when they want to be productive, when they want to get shit done, we want to increase their dopamine levels. They're sensitive to dopamine. So protein and fats. And then in the evening, we want to shut the brain down. So typically like a type 1A, I've seen type 1As do really well with just no carbs throughout the day. And then just the last meal, they have carbs. Or they could do like a post-workout and before bed. And that works really well for them. Similarly with a type 1B, usually type 1Bs gravitate towards intermittent fasting because that will stimulate noradrenaline. They feel more focused. And then they can also, gravitate towards that like protein and fats breakfast and then kind of, carbs post-workout, carbs before bed. Type 2As, we like variety. So it's kind of the same thing. Like we do well with some kind of a, approach where it might be like you're eating certain macros on training day versus non-training day, or you're rotating your protocol every 4 weeks. The one thing with type 2As is we tend to have less frequent meals. And that's because we're adrenaline sensitive. So the longer duration between meals, you'll typically get that adrenaline increase, which doesn't necessarily make it a good thing. Because if you're somebody who's overly stressed and then you're adding the stress of adrenaline increase by not eating frequently enough, that can be a net negative. But for the most part with 2As, we see them constantly wanting to change things. They're like, hey, we've been doing this thing for 2 weeks and I'm ready for the next phase. And so there's ways to kind of adjust the plan where you're keeping the progression in mind. You're giving them the variety similar to training, but you're still, keeping them in line with where they need to be. Type 2Bs, typical bodybuilder style, carbs before workout. They love to feel the pump. Carbs after workout, carbs before bed. And then like I mentioned with the type 3, it would be more of a higher carb plan to keep serotonin higher because they have naturally low levels. So everything that we look at, it's what's going to put this person in the best mental state. It doesn't matter if that's mental state to like do their job well or mental state in the gym. We have this, kind of when you look at brain activity, we have this like optimal level where our brain is amplified enough to perform well, but not overly amplified. So if there's not enough brain activity, you'll be lazy, you'll be unmotivated, you won't feel like doing anything. And typically what happens is once dopamine surpasses serotonin, then we feel ready. So if you've ever been at the gym and you're like, I just don't have it today, I don't feel like it, I don't feel like being here, and you're kind of like lollygagging through your warm up, and then all of a sudden it clicks and you're like, oh, okay, here I am. That's when dopamine surpasses serotonin. Now you're ready to go. So we have this optimal level. Then if brain activity becomes too much, like our neurons are firing too fast, now we get into this paralysis by analysis, overthinking, risk of injury. We get tight in the flexor muscles. That's over, like you're overreacting to things. So somebody who's in a pressure situation, right? Like if you think about the game's on the line, one shot to win the game. Guys like Jordan, Kobe, they had the ability to keep their brain activity. Now, obviously, they're not doing this consciously, but their brain activity stays in that optimal level. Whereas somebody who chokes under pressure, they might over rotate on the moment because it's such a big moment. Their neurons start firing. They're like, they overreact. It throws off their form. They miss a shot. So I always look at it as, what's the neurological state that we're trying to achieve? And then there's certain like fun, like I feel like we're starting at the advanced. So there's certain foundational pieces that I should have mentioned are assumed in all of this, which is like, what are the quality of the foods that you're eating? Like, how much are you eating, right? The basics. Are you moving your body each day? Are you drinking enough water? So I don't want to ignore like the base of the pyramid, which are all of those things that we have to get in order first.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, on this podcast, we talk a lot about that. I think, I hope, oh my God, if people by this point haven't been able to pick up on that, I'm doing a poor job of my part of the podcast here. But yeah, everyone should be at a good spot understanding those basics there. But that was fantastic. I loved how you explained that. It made a lot. I mean, just things clicked for me, which was super cool.
Awesome.
Anything else from you, Brian?
No, man, I think he answered everything that I had for him.
Okay, perfect. Mike, before we wrap this up, can you give everyone some more information where they can find yourself and more about what you do?
Yeah, for sure. So I am most active on Instagram, which would be at coach_Mike_Millner. Obviously, anybody can go take the assessment on my website, which is neurotypetraining.com. And then you should go listen to my interview with Aaron on the Mind Over Macros podcast, which is my podcast. And then I'll be connecting with Brian. I'll get you on the podcast soon.
Sweet. Sounds good, man.
Awesome. Mike, thank you for coming and sharing just very cool, new, different information that I know will be a first for a lot of the listeners who will appreciate that. So very cool.
Yep.
Guys, we will talk to you next week.